History of Mental Health by Juan Luis Cortez Cervantes. Lesson 4. The Construction of Scientific Identity. Thus, long before we had a worldwide cultural movement called science, we can trace the beginning of the historical movement as a cultural movement in ancient Greece, in the figure of Aristotle, who lived from the year 384 to the year 322 BC, and who established the foundations of what would become science. I invite every scholar to approach the authors I will mention and review how they were highlighting activities or making observations and comments that at the time were attacks against the gods or the social order. In the case of Aristotle, we can point to him as the main representative of an entire cultural movement that today we call philosophy, but that at the time had a very different historical and social development from that in which we live in a society without the internet, without universities, without smartphones, and basically relying on his memory and oral tradition, that is, the stories that circulated in his society. Aristotle's influence on the thought of his time is unparalleled, but as we have seen, human thought has many other representatives. If we point to Aristotle as one of the first representatives of scientific thought, it is because of the records we have of his work. For Aristotle, science was philosophy, and it was made up of systematic, orderly, disciplined observation and the construction of categories or groups through logic. Now, before moving on to the next great figure of science, review Aristotle's work called On the Soul, or also called About the Soul, to have a perspective on what the great teacher thought about the human mind centuries before psychology or psychiatry existed, along with the idea of mental health. For our next thinker, Ibn al-Haytham, also known as Alhazen or Alhazen, a practicing Muslim, mathematics replaced what Aristotle called philosophy, not as an activity, but as a value. This great thinker lived in what is now Iraq from the year 965 to the year 1040 after Christ. Here we can see that there is no better or worse men or process, but that people live knowledge and practice it as best they can in their social conditions. For Ibn al-Haytham, his own vision of the Muslim world and his conception of the Jewish God allows him a study of reality that would be condemned in other non-Islamic societies. It is not that Ibn al-Haytham sought to improve Greek thought, but based on his observations and his own experience and culture, he introduced both mathematics and experimentation as constitutive elements of a practice that allows him to obtain new knowledge and reach new conclusions, as well as ask new questions. So, we have the Greeks, we move on to the Muslims, and we arrive at medieval Europe. To introduce our next thinker, let's mention a word that might seem non-existent for our time, but for Francis Bacon it was a source of annoyance and therefore opposition. The word is scholastic. Truth is the daughter of time, not of authority. Francis Bacon, Novum Organum. In his statement, we can see an individual bothered by the influence of other subjects in the course of a thought that wants to acquire primacy or power over the thought of others, as if the thought had to go through the words of others to have the necessary reason to survive and prevail over contrary arguments. Although science has been a search for power through knowledge about what tradition has called the mysteries of spirits, the spiritual world has also served for a group of individuals to claim the right to exploit everything to their advantage. And with this thinker we can and should do a deeper review. Francis Bacon lived between 1561 and 1626. Although we can dismiss his first 15 or 20 years as part of his process of acquiring culture, his scientific activity is seen as the reflection of an English culture that faced the discovery of the American continent in 1492, the possibility of traveling and settling in strange places, and the beginning of the period that we know today as colonialism. While these possibilities occurred for all in Europe, in the religious field, a separation or division of Christian thought was brewing. The Roman monopoly on Christian discourse through Catholicism came to an end after the life and work of Martin Luther, who lived from 1483 to 1546. The publication of his 95 Theses in 1517 was the beginning of what would be called the Protestant Reformation. God was no longer the immaterial domain of the Roman Empire, and the Christian faith was no longer administered by the self-proclaimed chosen of God. Throughout Europe, communities were named as Catholic or Protestant, and on many occasions these differences led to thousands of deaths. This was the religious context under which Francis Bacon's parents grew up and our thinker was born. As part of a Protestant society, Francis Bacon grows up to find that tradition and authority outweigh the thought that can be generated to shape knowledge. A knowledge that is acquiring an identity separate from religion, but that today cannot be completely separated. Thus, in a Europe divided by religious thought, in a Catholic France, René Descartes was born. He lived from 1596 to 1650. It was René Descartes who would point out the importance of doubt about knowledge itself. That is, it is not about finding knowledge or answers, but rather the importance of scientific thinking is to generate new questions, new points of view. Of course, this is a summary of the contributions of each outstanding representative of scientific thought. I invite you to read everyone's works to have a more complete perspective. Although in making this invitation I can point out that science is also a search for which all the time of a single life is not enough. All of us who seek knowledge and the limits of it must resign ourselves to being partial participants or observers of human knowledge and power. It is due to our own temporal limitations that science itself has been divided into multiple specialties, but it is undoubtedly an exciting path. So, moving forward in the history of science, we have Galileo Galilei, who lived from 1564 to 1642. A thinker, heir to a Catholic culture, and a good example of how not all religious thought is the enemy of scientific development. It is the story of Galileo that makes it evident that when a group gains power, it will fight to defend that power against everything it calls its enemy. In other words, Galileo was born into a Catholic society and his discoveries led him to challenge the Catholic worldview. So in 1633, he was found guilty by Catholic ecclesiastical authorities of vehement suspicion of heresy, and forced to recant what he had discovered or acknowledged. It is not the intention of this study to condemn Catholic thought, but it is impossible not to point out that its role in history has placed it as an example of a power that will fight to defend itself from all the threats it could find in the world. Before advancing in this lesson, the author of this course emphasizes that he does not consider himself an enemy of Catholicism, and that in my personal conception this form of religion has as its main enemy its own hierarchical structure, its role in history, and the little interest it arouses in new generations of human beings, who have little interest in supporting an institution that is rather mysterious in its management. If Catholicism can sustain a God without a pope, a theology without priests, a forgiveness of sins without a confessional, then they may sustain their form of Christianity. The truth is, I don't care if there is a Catholic Church tomorrow or not. Indifference is not enmity. Now, within this brief tour we must point out two figures, one perhaps the greatest scientist in all of history and another who gave name to the fight between science and religion. Isaac Newton lived from 1643 to 1727. He was born and raised in an England deeply influenced by its colonialist interests in what would later be known as the United States. This thinker became aware of the struggle for independence of the English colonies on the new continent, but it is most likely that they did little to distract him from his advances in thought and scientific activity, which, by the way, was not opposed to his own conception of something we can call as a religion. That is, Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist in history, within his own vision of the world, conceived something similar to a relationship with the universe, in the way in which other people conceive their relationship with what they themselves call God. Newton's reading of the Bible did not lead him to be an ordinary Christian, but to challenge the intellectual order of his time for the love of God and truth. We must take advantage of Newton's case to point out a typical phenomenon in humanity. We can point out that many people ask, "Do you believe in God?" to be able to measure or calculate in some way how good or bad the person in front of them is, something like a quick view of a person's morality from their words. It may seem like an irrelevant phenomenon or approach, but let us remember that we have seen how health and disease processes approach social, ideological, and subjective phenomena to point out the differences. In other words, for some Catholics, Protestants are crazy for not believing in the Pope as God's representative on earth, and vice versa. In social terms, madness or mental illness is a way of pointing out the differences between human beings with the aim of attacking the other party. This specific use of mental health or illness does not usually come from doctors, psychologists, or psychiatrists, and yet it is a common use. In this dynamic, normality will always be defined by the particular conditions of the person who points out the madness in the other. Or, we can say that normality is defined by the self or the I of the interpreter. Now, to finish this brief tour of the development of scientific thought, we must include another nonconformist like Francis Bacon. But this subject in his nonconformity created sociology. We are talking about Auguste Comte, who lived from 1798 to 1857. Comte was born in a France deeply affected by what we today call the French Revolution, a historic movement in a society where the exercise of monarchical power and its union with the Catholic religion led to the reformulation of civil power through a tremendously violent social movement. French people killing other French people for a long time and sometimes out of mere suspicion. Although in terms of universal history, today we must point out the French Revolution as a very strong moment of social unity under the values of justice, equality, and brotherhood. We cannot forget that the symbol par excellence of said movement was the guillotine, a device specifically designed to kill a human being as quickly as possible and causing the least possible pain. A device that was directly responsible for the deaths of approximately 17,000 French people. In this context, Comte grows up seeing and accumulating emotions towards religion and religious people, including his own family. In this context, the religion was Catholicism. Over time and his studies and from a functional interpretation, Comte proposes a religion based on scientific thought. Comte calls his proposal philosophical positivism. He wrote, "Each of our main conceptions, each branch of our knowledge passes successively through three different theoretical states: the theological state, the metaphysical state, and the positive state." Auguste Comte, Positive Philosophy Course. We must close here this brief journey in the history of science with a warning. We have not stopped to reach what the author of the course considers to be the latest advance in scientific thought or an advance that marks the beginning of the phenomenon we know as mental health. That is, the author of this course does not consider philosophical positivism to be necessary or even possible, but part of the positivist premise consists of the recognition of scientific thought as superior to other forms of thought. In this context, we cannot fail to point out that the exercise of power in human society is something natural. And yet, this management that we can reduce to the phrase, "I command and you obey," just as it is natural in human coexistence since childhood. Also since childhood, many individuals have learned how they can defend themselves and manage their level of submission or acceptance of the orders or recommendations of a third party. If we have made a journey pointing out the relationship between scientific and religious thought, it is because in the end thought is thought. Strictly speaking, we do not know if thought should have a philosophical, scientific, or religious category. It is in practice or in the use we give to language where we can categorize or organize thought as religious or scientific or educational or political, depending on the goal it pursues. And there is another difference that the author of this course would like to consider in order to introduce one of the most important thinkers in the history of mental health. There are times when we are not able to register our own thoughts. In fact, according to this historical figure, thought itself escapes our register, our consciousness, and therefore our power. That being the case, then, what we say is not always what we think. Or sometimes what we say is exactly what we thought, but not what we meant. We will talk in the next lesson about Dr. Sigmund Freud.